Hello, and you're very welcome. A very good morning to this morning's Women in Fin Crime event. I'm Andrea Gilligan. I'll be your host for today's proceedings, and I'm delighted to be here, albeit virtually, but it's great to welcome so many of you to this morning's event. I can already see we have people, early risers, joining us from right across the globe. I see Sweden, Norway, Germany, France, Singapore, Hong Kong, Denmark, so many early risers, so it's great to have you all here with us for this morning's Women in Fin Crime event. It does really feel like a special morning. I think this event is all about capturing the zeitgeist of so many women in fin crime and AML and an FCC space too, in financial services, banking, law enforcement, right across the world. And I think it really is the beginning of a new movement here today. Just to flag, we do have 2 different discount codes available for all of our delegates, for our attendees. The details are going to be put in the chat box, but that will give you, the attendees, the annual subscription to AML Intelligence, and also as well free entry to some of the events for €120. The other 2 will give attendees entry to our next boardroom services event with FATF's David Lewis on the 25th of this month for €50 too. But the more interaction we have here this morning for this Women's Fin Crime event, the better. We want the event to really belong to you. You can engage with us today. You can get us on Twitter or on Facebook. And if you'd like to comment or get involved, you can use the hashtag. It's hashtag Women in Fin Crime. And you can also get us, you can tag us too at amlintelligence.com. It's going to be a fantastic morning. We've a really prestigious panel with us. And it's all ahead really of the celebrations for International Women's Day next week. But importantly, I think today is about championing the women in fin crime space. And as I said, I think we have a kind of a rich morning of discussion ahead of us. So I'd just like to introduce you to our esteemed panel. We're going to be joined by the Irish Justice Minister, Helen McEntree, who's also previously served as Minister for European Affairs. Rachel Pollack, who's the VP of Professional Services at NICE Actimize. Rachel's the current VP there of the services with EMEA, and also has 20 years experience, more than 20 years experience in the IT services industry. From Italy this morning with us here too is Fed Takonga, who's a partner in FTI Strategic Advisory on Financial Crime. Good morning, Sweden. Sounds a little bit like the Eurovision, but we too will have Sujata Dasgupta with us, who's the Global Head of Financial Crimes Advisory and Tata Consultancy Services. Kelly McCann, Financial Crime FI Advisory Expert, is also going to be with us. And Jackie King too, the Executive Director of International Business at IBEC. So look, as you can see, we've a really rich, esteemed panel with us here for this morning's event. Just to give you a brief run through of what's going to happen today, we're going to hear from a very talented panel. We'll also have a kind of a roundtable discussion a little bit later too in the session. But if you want to get involved, if you'd like to submit any questions for any of our delegates here today, please do so. Just to flag, you can do that via our Q&A session, and that's going to happen through your chat box. You can just submit the questions. It'll be on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll have a Q&A box for your questions. And through that chat box too, you can let us know where you're joining us from, because we'd love to hear where our delegates are today as well. Just to note, your questions won't automatically appear. They're all going to be moderated, and then they'll appear in the question box beside the stream. So please do feel free to give us some feedback on the right-hand side as well of the stream window for today's event. And just to mention, it is hashtag Women in Fin Crime. Now, you're not here to listen to me this morning, so I would like to introduce you to our first panellists, none other than the Irish Justice Minister, Helen McEntree. Minister McEntree has served as the Minister for Justice since June of last year. She's pledged to crack down on financial crime, the introduction too of the Criminal Justice Bill. So would you please welcome Minister Helen McEntree.
Good morning, Andrea. I'll just check that everyone can hear me okay. Good morning. Hi, sorry, I'll just check that everyone can hear me okay.
Yeah, we can hear you perfectly, Minister. We can hear you perfectly.
Perfect, sorry,
yeah.
That's okay. Well, look, good morning, Andrea. Thanks very much for inviting me to join you this morning. And I would echo your comments. While it's a pity that we can't meet in person and we haven't been able to for some time, I think these type of events and this type of space gives us a greater opportunity to have buy-in and connection from so many different parts of the world. So just welcome to everyone who is joining in this morning. Really delighted to join with you to mark International Women's Day, but also to champion the role that women play in combating financial crime. I have to say, I think I'm very fortunate myself to be Minister for Justice in Ireland at a time when we have so many women working within the justice space, not just within my own department, but right across the board in our court service, the head of our prison service, our 2 new deputy commissioners, our new state pathologist, all of whom are women. But also I was really pleased and delighted last year to announce the appointment of Una McPhillips, who is our Secretary General within the Department of Justice. And I was struck by something that she said on her appointment, that she could remember so many capable women that she had worked with throughout the years, who, if they had been working at a different time and had been in a different space, maybe they would have had a different opportunity, and they most likely would have progressed to the highest level long before her. So unfortunately that is the case, I think, for many women working in many different spaces, but times changing, and many barriers to women succeeding are failing away. And of course, perfect examples of that, we have Christine Lagarde, our first woman president in the European Central Bank, and I was particularly thrilled last year to see my colleague Mairead McGuinness, who is also a neighbour of mine in my own county, but also a good friend, being appointed the first woman European Commissioner to Financial Services last year. So while all of these appointments are very welcome, and they are wonderful to see, I think what we all want to see is that we get to a point in the future where we don't have to welcome these high-profile firsts, and we don't have to acknowledge women taking prestigious posts for the first time, which of course we still are, but we need to get to a point where such appointments are the norm and not something that we find remarkable. You mentioned that, my own role within European affairs, and unfortunately it's still the case that we have insufficient gender balance within some of the key EU economic positions. So it's something that we need to look towards greater gender balance, not just there, but in the business world too. I think we can all agree, and we all know, that the most effective way to improve corporate governance is diversity at senior board levels. And you know, if we look at boardroom diversity, it covers skills, covers thinking, experiences, careers, but also age, background, gender, and ethnic diversity. And a diverse board leads to more effective decision making. It leads to greater levels of critical analysis, and improved board dynamic, and really above all, it superior outcomes. In my own department in Justice, we have very many talented women working in this space, and who are contributing to absolutely crucial service at the senior management board level. I'm pleased to say that we have a ratio of 45% men to 55% women, so female teams leading essentially and planning our strategic future. We are maybe bucking the trend there, because in saying that, if we look back at some of the most recent figures that we have from 2018, over 50% of companies served by the International Labour Organization reported very low levels of women represented on their boards, and unfortunately 13% where there were no women at all. So there's a lot more that we need to do, and a lot more hopefully that we can do in the years ahead. Maybe just to talk a little bit about my own experiences, and obviously my own role and my responsibilities as Minister for Justice, with regards to money laundering and tackling economic crime and fraud. Ireland, maybe just to say first and foremost, has a very comprehensive and a robust statutory regime in place when it comes to anti-money laundering, and this is a type of criminality and a type of behaviour that we very seriously within government at all levels and across all of the relevant state agencies. Within my own department, the Anti-Money Laundering Compliance Unit was established back in 2010. This unit particularly supervises and inspects certain designated non-financial businesses and various different professions to ensure obviously that they are compliant with their legal obligation. I'm very pleased to say that this unit is well represented with women. The head of the unit, the deputy head of the unit, 3 of the regulatory investigators, and the head of administration are all female. In addition to that, obviously our law enforcement is extremely important in this space. We now have 26 women who are working within the National Economic Crime Bureau Police Force and Garda Síochána, and this is a bureau that we are expanding, and I suppose in a most recent report, the Hamilton report, which has made a number of recommendations on how we can improve our overall system, it identifies the need to provide greater numbers and greater support for the Criminal Bureau, and that's something that I'm very focused on and want to see, obviously, much, if not more, greater female participation as well. I think as Minister for Justice, the way that I would look at it, while our structure in Ireland at the moment, the Anti-Money Laundering Steering Committee is chaired through the Department of Finance, but it also includes my own department, the Department of Defence, Department of Business, the Criminal Assets Bureau, Revenue, and many others who are working on it actively. But that needs to extend beyond, obviously, our own work locally, at a European level and internationally as well. And I think that's the only way that we are going to actually fight cross-border crime of all types, including money laundering and terrorist financing. We've seen real benefits already through An Garda Síochána and the work that they have done with other law enforcement agencies across Europe, but at home, cross-border, north and south. The PSNI and the Gardaí work very well together. We've worked, of course, with Europol, we've worked with Interpol on a number of successful joint operations with agencies across many of the jurisdictions. Europol, maybe just to touch on that briefly, I mean, it is an absolutely critical resource. It provides our own policing service with the opportunities for exchanging knowledge, exchanging best practice with our counterparts from across Europe, but it also allows us to use a secure information exchange system and analytical support for any of the major investigations. And as I've said, we've had some success in recent years, and obviously we want to strengthen that cooperation and continue and that level of collaboration. One such example, I think, the law enforcement authorities from 31 states, including Ireland, working with Europol, Eurojust and the European Banking Federation, working on the European Money Mule action. Obviously, this targets schemes which rope in victims who are very often unaware that they are being used, or that the money that they are sending is an elaborate scheme. And this is one of the operations which I think is making a vital contribution to keeping our public safe. And it's more of these types of operations showing that level of collaboration among member states and authorities. This is how we're, I think, going to continue to tackle this really important issue. More broadly, maybe just to say, Ireland is a very active and very engaged international partner in this sphere. We're an active member of the Financial Action Task Force, which leads the international body for countering the financing of terrorism and money laundering. Ireland's Financial Intelligence Unit also participates in the Egmont group of 165 financial intelligence units, which provide a platform for secure exchange of expertise, financial intelligence to combat money laundering and terrorist financing. We've also ratified the United Nations Conventions Against Corruption, the OECD Convention on Bribery in International Business Transactions, and the Council of Europe States Against Corruption. We're also subject to ongoing peer evaluations, which again is another important element of this. This looks at policies, it looks at our procedures to prevent corruption, and of course this includes money laundering and terrorist financing as well. I think what we need to all acknowledge, and particularly when we look at how we deal with this into the future, and the fact that, you know, there's a requirement and a need for us to continually invest in upgrading our technologies, acknowledging the fact that all crime gangs and those who involve themselves in this type of criminality, they have no respect for borders, which makes the work that Ireland is doing in other states to combat money laundering extremely important. But the need to share that knowledge, that expertise, that development of technology is so important, that we're not dealing with this on our own, that we're dealing with this collectively at European level and internationally as well. Finally, if I could just say, I think publications such as AML Intelligence play a really important part in fighting anti-money laundering. Access to sources of relevant information, relevant news, analysis, this kind of valuable service to the public, and in particular to specialists in this field, is extremely important. And I just thank you for the work that you're doing in this space, but also for organising this event this morning. I think it's really important that we have this platform, I suppose in particular on International Women's Day, or to mark International Women's Day, to champion the work that has been done by women in this space, but also to use this as a platform to be able to share expertise, knowledge, information, and really that is absolutely key if we are going to be able to tackle these criminals and to deal with anti-money laundering in the long run. It's about having a mutual trust, a mutual respect. It's about sharing that information. It's about working in collaboration, and platforms like this, I think, allow us to develop and to grow that, to grow in that particular space. So really pleased to be with you this morning. Really pleased to join so many wonderful women on this platform, and I just want to wish you well for your event and to each and every one of you in your own careers and the work that you're doing. Thank you.
Justice Minister Helen McEntree, thanks very much for your opening address here at this morning's Women in Fin Crime event. Lots to consider there. I do want to maybe just pick you up on one or 2 points. I know you probably have a busy day ahead, but if I can, just before you go, we are here obviously to examine the role of women in financial services, and as he said, to mark International Women's Day next week. But can I just ask you in a practical sense, for some of our delegates worldwide across Europe that are tuned in here to today's conference, the practical cooperation between the likes of your own department in justice and financial services in trying to, I suppose, work together to fight financial crime. How do you kind of see that working in a practical sense?
Well, really, I suppose it's about communication. It's about collaboration. Say, it's for example, my own department, as I've said, there are many departments and there are many agencies within this space in Ireland who are working together, and it's about putting it on a footing as possible. We had a report which was commissioned and published last November called the Hamilton Report, looking at the structures that are currently in place, how we can improve them, and they made 3 key recommendations really. One was around structural change, so it was about making sure the way in which currently state agencies, departments and Garda Síochána, law enforcement, how they work together, that's put on a more statutory footing, that there is an organisation that can then, with these agencies working together, identify risk, identify work that government needs to do, and on a yearly basis that they would then feed into government, feed into departments and identify where further work needs to be done, obviously working in collaboration with any EU directives or work that's been done at a European or an international level. Secondly, they recommended new legislative change. So there's a number of pieces of legislation that I and my colleague in Justice are working on at the moment, some of it in support of our law enforcement so that they can have greater access to new types of technology, greater access to be able to use their own technology to identify risk and to be able to bring forward evidence when it comes to trial. Recommendations around preliminary trial hearings, which is something that I'm bringing through Parliament myself at the moment, and other areas as well. And then the third really is about resourcing, and I mentioned the Garda National Economic Crime Bureau earlier, and it is about making sure that there are resources, that there are the bodies on the ground, there are teams working in this space, that they have the finance to develop technologies in this space as well. So really it's about a huge level of cooperation. It's about putting it in as much as possible on a structural footing and a statutory footing, and it's about making sure that there is that mutual trust and cooperation between government, between agencies, between law enforcement, respect for our own regulatory framework, for our own legislative framework, and I think that you constantly need to build on that in the same way that you apply that when you're working on an international level as well.
You mentioned, Minister, the work of your colleague, Raid McGuinness, the now European Commissioner too for Financial Stability and Services. And obviously we're here to mark International Women's Day, or ahead of it next week. How do we kind of get that greater diversity in positions like in your own and Raid McGuinness and right across the financial sector as well?
Well, I don't think we should ever apologise I think we need to make a conscious decision that we're going to promote women, that we're going to put women forward. And I think Ursula von der Leyen, once she became the President of the European Commission, said very clearly that her cabinet and that her group of commissioners, that there was going to be 50-50 female representation with male representation. And I think we need to be as bold as that and say that that's going to happen. If you look at politics, even for example in Ireland over the last number of years, our first minister was back in the 1919, and the next cabinet minister was 1979. So, if we're going to wait for things to happen, we could be another 100 years waiting to get to the point where we have equal representation. So we've introduced gender quotas here in Ireland. While it might not be something that everybody agrees with, we have seen increase in female representation and participation because of that. But also, I think events like this, women championing women, women supporting other women in these roles, but equally men supporting women. We had recently in my own department, which has since separated, our first Minister for Equality, who was a man, and while there might have been debate over that, we're not having men championing and encouraging equality in many of these spaces where we haven't had it before. We're not going to see it. So I do think it's very much about visibility as well, seeing more women in roles, and I think younger people as well. One of the elements of my job that I love, while I'm obviously Minister for Justice, I'm also a constituency TD. I engage with schools a lot, with young women a lot. And I think when they see women in roles that they maybe perhaps haven't seen before, it encourages them, and it gives them the courage themselves to put themselves forward and to know that this is possible. So, we still have more work to do. We're not quite there yet, but I think it's moving in the right direction.
Just on that, Minister, maybe just on a final question. I know you've announced you're due your first baby in May, and congratulations. And you are a role model for so many women across this country. So I just wonder, I hate having to actually ask you this question in Ireland in 2021 when we look at the advances that we've made on so many issues. But for a lot of women tuned into us here today at this Women in Fin Crime conference, they will have had the opportunity to, when they've had their first baby, they've taken maternity leave, like so many other women across Ireland will have a constitutional right to do that. And yet so publicly you have to kind of grapple with that, and there's a constitutional question over your maternity leave. Does that disappoint you now in Ireland in 2021?
I think it is disappointing that we're still talking about this, because while I'm the first female cabinet minister to have a baby, I'm not the first woman in politics to have a baby. We've had many colleagues only in recent years as TDs, as senators, as ministers of state, and nothing has changed. And that's what's really disappointed me. So we have the Constitution in Ireland, which is a wonderful thing, but is often very difficult, because in order to change it, you need a referendum, which in itself is quite a complex thing. So what I'm doing at the moment is working with colleagues to identify how I can take maternity leave, because as you've said, there's no provision there for it at the moment. But most importantly, what I don't want to happen is for me to find a way that kind of suits the situation, that is a sticking plaster for my my position, but that doesn't change anything. So I'm working with colleagues to make sure that whatever mechanism we put in place, that we have a longer term objective, which will unfortunately require a referendum to enable women to take maternity leave in politics. But I think it's where we go. It's the space that we need to be in, because if we're not leading by example, then it's very hard for whether it's private or public sector to follow in that space as well. So hopefully we'll see some change after the next few months, and that in itself I think will encourage more women to get involved in politics, where they know that there are options available to them, and they can work without actually feeling that their job is going to be jeopardised, or that they have to be back in the office 5 days later, which has happened to some of my colleagues. And I'm sure many women across many spaces have been in that position before, but we really need to fight and make sure that we can put these type of structures in place.
Yeah, and we'll keep a close eye on how developments emerge there as well. But for this morning, the Justice Minister, Helen McEntree, thanks very much for your time here and the opening address at this year's Women in Fin Crime event. As I said, if you want to get in contact with us, please do so. You can send in any of your questions that you might have. We will, of course, have the rest of our panellists coming up and that roundtable discussion, and you can get it on the chat box. Also, as well, if you want to engage in social media, it's the hashtag Women in Fin Crime event. Now, on to our second speaker this morning here for today's proceedings. We're heading to Sweden and to Sujata Dasgupta, who is the Global Head of Financial Crime Advisory with Tata Consultancy Services. So a very good morning, Sujata.
Thank you, Andrea, and hello and welcome everybody Feels great to be here on this distinguished panel today, especially talking about a subject which is very close to my heart, that's on financial crimes prevention and interception. When we talk about this whole fight against financial crimes, the most common thing, the common response that comes as to why it is so significant, the conversation invariably tends to move towards regulatory penalties. But I wanted to touch upon a more significant, a more larger and far-reaching impacts of financial crimes, which are not discussed so often. So, firstly, to me, if I have to take the top three reasons, the first one for me would be the human and social impact. We are all aware of the laundered money, how it comes and where it goes. So there are the terrorist financing, the illegals, arms trade, the drug trafficking, sex trafficking, child abuse, human slavery. All of these have a tremendous impact on human life and the society. So by preventing or intercepting financial crimes, I think we can sort of impact the human lives by improving the quality of human lives and the society at large. The second, I would think, is the environmental impact. We hear a lot about wildlife trafficking, illegal wildlife trade. There is a huge amount of money involved because there is all this trade passing through different countries and continents, and a lot of criminal money. It's like billions of dollars of criminal money, which passes through these channels, and this in turn threatens the biodiversity, and it disturbs the ecological balance, which in turn in the longer term is going to impact our planet as well. So it is extremely important to be preserving our wildlife and prevent them from being trafficked and intercept financial crimes in that process as well. The third, according to me, would be the economic impact. We are aware of at least $2 trillion every year, which are laundered, and this is a huge amount of money. So, regulatory penalties is one which banks and financial institutions have to pay to regulators for either deficiencies or violations. But $2 trillion per year, and this is only an estimated amount. Nobody knows the actual count. If this much amount of money is sucked out of the economy every year, imagine how much good it could have done to for the welfare of the people had it been in the legal financial system. So I think prevention of financial crimes is extremely important in order to meet these stop these three kinds of disastrous impacts on human lives, on wildlife and ecological balance, and the economy overall. So we just heard the minister, Ireland's Justice Minister Helen McEntree. So picking that discussion from her, we heard how much the amount of effort and attention that she is paying to drive this initiative within her country, and the impact that they are having globally in terms of participating in EU related drives, and globally because they're part of FATF and the other organizations. So the tremendous amount of work that she herself is driving for her country. We also have similar examples like Janet Yellen, who's the moment she took office as the Secretary of Treasury in US, she has been driving this agenda for her country. So these high-profile offices, if they are driving this whole agenda of preventing and intercepting money laundering, this validates how important and how significant this whole initiative of fin crime prevention and our fight, how important that is. Now, because everybody is now recognized that this has far-reaching impacts just beyond the regulatory penalties. So what are the trends that we are seeing? Again, both from the regulatory and the institutional side, we are witnessing a lot of effort. If I like to talk in threes so that the discussion becomes really objective. So if I have to again talk about the top three trends, I would pick the harmonization of regulations across jurisdictions. As we know that regulators are bound by their own jurisdictions, they enact laws for their own countries or regions, like the EU. And though the overall guidelines are provided by the regulatory bodies globally, each country has to enact its own regulation. Now, though basically they are more or less the same, but there are subtle differences. What we are witnessing now is that criminals used to exploit these very small gaps just in terms of interpretation of regulations or some slight variations in the nuances, in the criteria. And they were trying to slip in through those cracks to push their illegal money around. But what we are seeing now is harmonizing of those regulatory rules. A couple of examples could be EU's sixth money laundering directive, where we are hearing about the 22 predicate crimes which have been objectively described, and there is a clear definition. So across the EU and UK also, which is also complying to this EU sixth ML directive. So there is a harmonized definition of all these 22 predicate crimes, so that there is no difference, no gap through which a criminal could enter and send his money through the EU or UK. Another example could be the beneficial ownership regulation harmonization. Beneficial ownership is something which got enacted, I think, a few years ago across all jurisdictions. But again, there are some subtle differences. For example, if I take EU-UK example, I think from the fourth money laundering directive onwards, that was somewhere around 2017, when ultimate beneficial ownership identification verification became mandatory. And at the same time, every country was mandated to create and establish their own central registries of beneficial ownership, which would form as a central database for both institutions as well as regulatory bodies to refer to. But in US, if we compare, the same beneficial ownership rule was there, but the registry was not there. The registry was not mandated. However, with the AML Act 2020, we saw that that rule also got harmonized, because now they have the Corporate Transparency Act, which mandates even in US, the FinCEN is now going to create and maintain a central registry of beneficial ownership. So the point I'm trying to make here is the rules, though there were subtle differences, but the rules are now getting harmonized across the globe. So there are no cracks being left, and those gaps are being closed slowly across regulators, across jurisdictions. The second, I think, is the broadening scope of this whole fight against financial crimes. So we are seeing an increasing number of typologies in financial crimes which are getting included into these regulations. For example, we now have cybercrime included, we have environmental crimes included, we have crypto asset related regulations. So these are all new, and these are all slowly evolving. So our scope of financial crimes and the typologies are also broadening. So the news around the criminals are being tightened, so that if they're bypassing the regular fiat financial system and trying to use the crypto asset instead, that is also something which is now being regulated. So this is the second point I wanted to mention. The third, I think, is the encouragement from the regulators in using advanced technology, data, and collaboration amongst institutions. So that's the financial institutions, the regulators, the law enforcement. There is this impetus, this emphasis on collaboration. The minister also just mentioned that criminals do not know borders. They do not care about jurisdictions. They do not care about channels or payment methods or borders. So if the criminals are organized in networks and across countries, the same should be done to fight those criminals as well. So regulators are focusing a lot of time and attention to encourage this use of advanced technology, like your artificial intelligence, your machine learning, NLP, and so on, and the use of data. So data is being encouraged to be used tremendously in this fight against financial crime. And collaboration, it could be interbank collaboration or PPP, that is public-private partnership, that kind of collaboration across all organizations. This is something which is being encouraged by regulators across the globe. We have seen the UK's FCA, for example, they have been organizing this tech sprint, bringing together the technology and the institutions where they can explore advanced technology for preventing financial crimes. We have seen AUSTRAC, that's Australia's regulator, which has organized something called Fintel Alliance in Australia, where a number of banks and the regulators come together to share intelligence, We have seen US's FinCEN exchange, which is a step in the same process. We're also seeing closer home in EU. We are seeing the Estonia's AML bridge, which is again a similar concept. It is in the pilot phase right now. So these are all examples where we are seeing that regulators are encouraging the use of technology as well as participating in that process. So it's not just like preach; they are also practicing it. And this is all using advanced technology in order to share data, share intelligence, and work in a concerted manner in the fight against financial crime. So, having said that, what is the way forward then for financial institutions? So we are aware of what are the significance, what are the far-reaching impacts. We are aware of it now. We are seeing very high-profile offices driving this agenda of financial anti-crimes. We are seeing frameworks laid down, regulations laid down, technology innovation in place. So because the crimes are becoming more complex and the volume and variety is also it's huge. So the institutions which are at the forefront of managing these financial crimes risk to prevent, intercept, investigate, and report them, there is a lot of responsibility on them. So how do they manage all these things? Because on the one hand, there are crimes which are increasing in the kind of complexity, sophistication, because the same technology are also being used by the criminals to make their methods and mechanisms more complex and sophisticated. It becomes harder to track them. And on the other hand, you have regulations which try to prevent those kind of crimes. So what should be the way forward for financial institutions? Now you have all of this together. So again, I would like to talk about the top three areas which probably financial institutions could look at. The three levers, as I like to call them: people, process, and technology. In terms of people, we are aware that workforce management is extremely important. Getting skills in the area of financial crimes prevention, getting trained analysts and investigators is not easy. This is not a skill which is acquired overnight. This has to be practiced with the investigations over a period of time. People acquire that knack as to where to find that needle in the haystack. So this is an acquired skill. It takes a bit of time. And with all these changes that is happening in regulations, in technology, in the kind of crimes that are being committed, organizations need to keep their people skilled and motivated. And also there should be retention policies, because people moving out cannot be replaced as easily. It's not something like you give a 1 week training and somebody is able to detect financial crimes, because these are very complex. So this is about the people part, where there should be a robust workforce management, especially in the area of financial crimes. There has to be a tone from the top, a culture which motivates that this is a very important function. It's not like a regular, routine job. This is a very niche skill, and it needs to be maintained, like motivated, and the people need to be updated on their skills regularly. So that's the people part. On the process part, there have to be very strong frameworks, because we are again seeing a lot of the change in financial crimes typologies, the kind of crimes that are happening. It's not a manual process anymore, like we were talking about, the kind of AI and the amount of data that needs to be processed. There are, of course, we see with most large institutions which are working across the globe, they have disparate systems and processes. So there should be some strong policies and compliance frameworks which unifies all these processes, because it has to be about unified processes across the globe. So the theme should be build global, execute local, that kind of concept, where you also take the local nuances, the local country specific regulations into process. And the third, I would say, is we have stressed enough on it about the technology. There has to be an upgrade of technology, and we're moving away from the legacy, the rule-based platforms, to it's more data-driven and AI-powered platforms, which is going to drive the future. So I think the people, process, and technology, these strategies have to be reimagined by organizations, and that is what could drive the fight against fin crime in the new decade. I think we all must try to do our bit in this fight, because we are now aware of the huge impact, and let us all try to do our bit in saving the economy, the environment, and the humanity at large. Thank you so much.
Sujata Dasgupta, thank you so much for your contribution this morning. I thought you had a couple of really interesting points around the intelligence and data sharing, and also to the role of AI in disrupting financial crime. So I might maybe come back to you to pick up on some of those points actually a little bit later in our panel discussion. And I do want to say as well to any of our delegates, if you have a question for Sujata or any of the rest of our panellists, please do get in touch with us this morning. You can do so on the, you can submit your questions just via the Q&A section on the right hand side of your screen, and you can get us on social media, Twitter, Facebook as well. If you'd like to comment, you can use the hashtag, it's hashtag women in FinCrime, and you can also tag to amlintelligence.com. That was Sujata Dasgupta from the Global Head of Financial Crime Advisory at Tata Consultancy Services. Now it's Fed Takonga, who's a partner with FTI Strategic Advisory on Financial Crime. If you'd like to give a warm virtual welcome to Fed. Good morning.
Good morning. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for the introduction. As Italian, I never know whether I should introduce myself as one or the other. I have 2 passports and I run a practice that is both EMEA, so it's based in the UK, but it's EMEA wide. So I'm a citizen of the world. And actually, that has relevance in what I'm going to be saying today. As I grew up, as I made my way into the financial services, I didn't think I was going to become a feminist. I didn't think that feminism was needed anymore. I thought we were all collectively done with talking about why women should be represented. And I actually, if I'm entirely honest, disliked certain approaches that were strongly pushing women in a certain direction. Once again, because I thought it took away from the merits of women. With years and years in financial services, is in a position, in a profession that is rather unique and unique for women still, I have come to slowly change my mind. And I would like today to invite you to reflect with me on the topic, not of just women in this industry, but in general of diversity in this industry. And the way in which I would like to do it today is by talking about, first of all, which diversity are we really talking about? The second thing I would like you to reflect on with me is the fact that it seems to me that we've moved away from the open discrimination of diversity. However, we are still facing perhaps a more dangerous subliminal suppression of diversity. And then finally, I would like to show you what happens when we embrace diversity. So as to the first point of which diversity, when you look at me, you see a woman. And for that reason, you put me in a certain category, you assign certain labels to me. Giving places to people like me, giving places, seats at tables to women alone, does not guarantee diversity. Diversity means accepting people who are young. It means accepting people who have an accent. It means accepting people who think differently. And I have seen challenges in accepting that type of diversity. The world has now come to accept that somehow we need to have the pretty looking female woman at the table. But we have not necessarily come to accept that that woman can be young looking, can be pretty looking, can be ugly looking. We've come to accept that we need to have something that looks different, but not necessarily something that thinks differently. And when we hear those different opinions being raised, we discount them. Or when we hear perfectly valid opinions coming from the mouth of something that looks different, we'd discount them. When we face problems and we don't have diversity in the room, we have a problem because we might not spot the outlier. And for anyone who works in a space of financial crime, like me, spotting the outlier is quite important. Spotting the pattern is quite important. And I don't want to go into the topic of the spectrum, various variety of thoughts, etc. But it is quite important to recognize that it's diversity of thinking that makes us better. It's diversity of thought that makes my team extremely successful. We've solved some of the biggest challenges of financial crime around the world, and we've done that not because we all feel and look the same, but because we can all challenge one another, we can all challenge the status quo. And so back to the topic, I have seen in recent time too much subliminal suppression. I have seen too many women being invited to the table but not being listened to, their opinion being completely ignored. I've also seen a lot of token women and diversity being brought to the table, and that's not what we need. Once again, we need diversity because we truly believe in the value of diversity. We don't need to just bring someone who looks different to the table, but who actually thinks exactly like everyone else. We need the ability to accept the challenge of the status quo. And the reason why we don't like challenge is a very human, deeply rooted reason. We are pack animals, and we instinctively feel otherness as threatening. It's the wolves that are coming to attack us. It's something that will force us to have to defend ourselves. So taking the step to accept diversity in the workplace, to accept diversity in what we do, needs to be a conscious effort. And unless we force ourselves to do it, to want to embrace it, we will not naturally do that. And I've noticed I'm lucky to have had an extremely different upbringing, to have had an extremely different life. And as such, I am perhaps more open to challenge. I am more open to accepting diversity of thoughts, because by growing up in different countries, by experiencing different people, I have come to realize that not all of that, not all that looks different is threatening. But that is not true for the majority of people that we see around us. And so it is important that we challenge and that we speak up. And that's, I go back to my point, the reason why I'm here today is because there have been lots of times when I've thought that this didn't need to be said, that it was obvious enough. But I realized that it is not obvious enough. I realized that people look at me and people like me and they see the pretty face. They don't realize how many degrees I have, that most of them are mathematical, that I speak many languages, that I am a pilot and I fly my own plane. And I speak about myself because deliberately I do not want to bring others into this conversation. There is so much diversity, there is so much underneath people that needs to be brought to the table, it needs to be brought to the workplace. Why all of this in relation to financial crime? Financial crime is a topic that's extremely close to my heart. I'm a nerd. You can come and talk to me about financial crime any day. But I do feel I've come to realize that the reason why I am so good at what I do, and forgive my arrogance, and my team is so brilliant at what I do, is because we really are diverse. We challenge one another. We're not diverse because we have women. There are fantastic men in my team who are diverse in the way in which they approach the topic, in the way in which they approach the challenge. If you would like to bring up the slide that I have here, I just wanted to give you a sense as to one particular example of how diversity helped us. The image with all the confused lines jumping from one country to the other is the typical scenario that we face when we're trying to unravel networks of shell companies, opaque ownership that is used by criminals to hide their doings and to exploit the financial services system. That alone, that mess, that picture that you see there, does not take us in any direction. It gives us an indication of the fact that there is crime, but does not help us to do what we need to do, which is to tell a regulator or an enforcement agency who has done what. And we were looking at that picture for a long time, and we were about to give up. And then finally someone found the thread. Someone was able to put structure in order to it. And we went from that line picture that you see there to the much more structured one that you see in the bottom, which is a proper description of what was going on. And it happened in no time. And truly, we can move away from the slide. We were about to give up. And the person who solved this puzzle is a person, an individual who had been completely ignored and even sort of almost threatened to be kicked out of another team because they didn't fit in, because they didn't think like everyone else. They were accused of not being clever enough to fit in that team. And yet that person, given the opportunity, was able to solve one of the many puzzles that we solve every day. We need diversity. We need diversity in financial crime for exactly that reason. Nothing will ever move forward if we all continue to think in the same way, to act in the same way, to say the same things. It is different. There's a completely different experience in going through this industry as a woman, as a young person, as someone who's been perhaps a little more successful than others at a younger age, someone who speaks up. It is incredibly different. And I shouldn't be here today telling people to listen to us, to give us space. I am, and it's unfortunate, and I hope that the next generation will not have to. Thank you for listening to me.
Fed, thank you very much for your remarks today. I thought you had some really interesting points actually around diversity, and we might come back to those in the panel discussion a little bit later. But just before you go, Fed, I do want to just go to some of our interaction here from our delegates this morning at the event. Martin has got in touch to say, Federica's a star, a lesson in delivering a powerful message in such a meaningful and controlled way. And Sue Scott as well has got in touch with us, Fed, to say it's all about the willingness to accept that we have an unconscious bias. The challenge then is being prepared to rewire our brains to move beyond the unconscious and notice the bias and deliberately choose to think differently. Do you want to comment maybe just on Sue's comments there or her remarks?
Oh, absolutely. The topic of unconscious bias is exactly what we need to be talking about. I've avoided the words because on occasion we tend to see the label and not go under the surface. You know, I have myself been in training for all relating to unconscious bias, and we've kind of gone around the topic and not said it. So I think that we need to use labels, but we also need to use extremely plain language, and we need to talk about the experiences, the diverse experiences that we all face through life, because that will help those who hold that bias to understand quite how different the world is and how beautiful it is for that.
Fed Takonga, as I said, partner at FTI Strategic Advisory on Financial Crime. Thanks so much for joining us here and for your contribution. And we'll come back to you a little bit later with our roundtable discussion during this morning's event. I want to say hello to from those in Greece. Portugal, Berlin, all getting in touch with us here on the hashtag Women in Fin Crime, and getting in touch with us as well on the Q&A chat box if you'd like to do so. So good morning and thanks for your contributions. Now our next guest this morning is the Vice President of the Professional Services at NICE Actimize, Rachel Pollack. Rachel has more than 20 years of experience across the IT services industry, and she's here to address us this morning. Good morning, Rachel.
Thanks, Andrea, and good morning, everyone. First, I'd like to say that I'm absolutely delighted to be participating in today's Women in Financial Crime conference. It's a real honour to be here among so many accomplished women. And I have to say, Federica, I really did enjoy that talk you just did. It was very, very thought-provoking. So during my time at NICE Actimize, I've had the privilege of working with over 100 financial institutions, including retail, commercial and private banks, asset and wealth management firms, money service bureaus, and insurance companies, among others, many of which operate across geographies and language and currency and culture. This experience has given me some insight into how we can use innovation to fight financial crime, but it also has given me some insight into how we can ensure a successful delivery and adoption of these advanced technologies. This is a theme that Sujata also mentioned in her presentation. You know, we can't fight financial crime with manual approaches. It has to be through innovation. So I wanted to start by considering some of the challenges faced by many financial institutions in this space today. First of all, there's a lot more regulation than ever before, and we all know that non-compliance with AML obligations can lead to significant fines and sanctions, as well as reputational damage. Another challenge faced by financial institutions is the rate at which we are transacting online, or digital acceleration as it's sometimes referred to. So while we transform into a largely cashless society where financial institutions offer more and more digital products and services, this digital world is actually fueling financial crime. And that's because criminals are using those same systems to develop ever more sophisticated scams. And finally, another challenge that is faced by so many financial institutions is the cost of compliance. It's just growing. You know, as the crime and regulations increase, so does the cost of managing that compliance. And it's a big challenge for many organizations today. Costs aren't going down, they're just going up. So while it's true that most financial institutions do have, at some level, some systems and controls in place to detect, disrupt, and stop criminal activity, the changing nature and pace of criminals means that these systems and controls don't always change as quickly as the threats do. So in order for us to be faster than the criminals and also keep up with the changing regulations, we must adopt more innovative technologies than they do. There's quite a lot going on in this area. There's a huge amount of innovation taking place. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to mention three. One of the areas is artificial intelligence and machine learning. This simply refers to software algorithms that can predict outcomes and make inferences. So within the context of financial crime, these algorithms learn from experience and can detect hidden patterns of criminal activity. Another area that's really taken off is robotics process automation. And again, this simply means software that can automate highly repetitive tasks. And the good thing about that is that it means that the skilled compliance workers and case investigators can focus on higher value activities, so they can do more with less effectively. And the final innovation trend that I want to mention is biometrics. Being able to identify individuals through face recognition, for example, allows financial institutions to reduce fraud and financial crime risks through more accurate customer identification. So I've just touched on some of the innovation. I absolutely agree what Sujata said about fighting financial crime with innovation and with technology, advanced technologies. It's absolutely essential. There is no other way of doing it. But my area of expertise, or my area of experience at least, is very much about, once a financial institution has selected the technology, the preferred technology to combat financial crime, how do you actually make that program successful? It's a big challenge, and it requires everyone within the organization throughout different departments to be involved in it. So the question is, how do you set up your program for success? Again, in the interest of time, I could talk about this topic for a very long time, but I'm going to choose 6 things that I feel are really important to get right. So the first one is around your financial crime strategy and business goals. So as an organization, you should absolutely ensure that the strategy sits within your overarching corporate strategy, because financial crime management is not only the job of the chief compliance officer, and I'm sure that there are many people on this in this conference today that would agree with that. It's not just their job to ensure that the organization is compliant. Perhaps encourage the firm to foster a culture of compliance so that everyone feels accountable. It's not just one department's job. And if you're struggling to translate your company's risk appetite and regulatory needs into your business requirements, perhaps talk to other financial institutions, your peers, to see what they're doing in this space. So it's important to make sure that the financial crime strategy and your business goals are absolutely aligned to the strategy of the organization that you're working in. I think the second area of focus is around collaboration. When you're embarking on a program to implement an advanced technology to combat financial crime, the program requires collaboration between many different stakeholders within your organization. It involves the compliance department, obviously. It involves IT because you're implementing technology. It involves the people who are responsible for the data within your organization, so perhaps data centers. It also involves end users and executive sponsors. This program is not just another IT project. In fact, I don't believe it is an IT project. The technology comes into play because you're simply adopting new technology to address the business problem of financial crime. So it's important that when you embark on this program, that you absolutely make sure that it is, it is done with collaboration between the various different departments within your organization. I also believe that you should recognize the project as a business change program. The introduction of this intelligent technology is going to radically change the way you manage financial crime. Your operating model will change, and no doubt your investigators will be working differently to how they are today. So the question is, are you ready for this change, and how can you as an organization better facilitate that change company-wide? By doing that, you are standing a far better chance of ensuring that that technology is adopted and that you're driving the very best value out of that technology. Another important area is data, which I know one of the other speakers also spoke about earlier. Given that accurate detection relies so heavily on having the correct data and quality data, you need to ensure that you start the program with an assessment to make sure that you have no data gaps, or if you do, which you will inevitably have, to have mitigation steps to bridge those gaps so that it doesn't actually impact the accuracy of your detection. And you're wanting to avoid things like false positives and so on. The other area when embarking on a program of this kind is that you need to continuously innovate. So once you've delivered your financial crime management solution, you've adopted this advanced technology, you're utilizing artificial intelligence and other innovations. You mustn't stand still. You must continuously look at the various different financial crime patterns. You must look at the regulatory governance and ensure that, obviously, as that changes, you need to continuously enhance the solution that you've implemented at the beginning. And the final thing I think that is important to think about is self-sufficiency. it really is essential that you understand the solution that you're adopting. Nowadays, the regulators have become far more sophisticated and actually educated in this area, and they will be asking you to justify the rationale behind some of the configuration decisions that you've made. It is ultimately your responsibility as a financial institution to articulate this and not necessarily the vendor. So those are 6 areas that I think is really important to consider when embarking on a program of this nature. So in summary, there is an awful lot to think about when defining your strategy, your financial crime strategy and approach to fighting financial crime. As I said, FIs are facing more and more regulatory demands. There's more pressure to reduce the cost of compliance. Adoption of innovative technology can help drive down cost of compliance and achieve more accurate detection. But when considering all of this, you must consider how you will set yourselves up for successful financial crime delivery program so that you can drive the very best value out of the solution. Thanks very much.
Rachel, thanks very much for your contribution today. I think some really practical and invaluable advice there as well for delegates. So thanks very much for that. For any of our delegates watching, listening that want to ask a question, you can do so. You can do it through the Q&A chat box, also on the right-hand side of your screen, or either if you want to engage with us on social media, you can do so on the likes of Twitter, Facebook, and you can get us at #WomenInFinCrime, and you can also tag as well at amlintelligence.com. Rachel, just before I let you go, I suppose the reason we're doing this virtually today and we're not in a conference room here in Dublin is all with thanks to, of course, the coronavirus. And I just wonder, has COVID-19 impacted financial crime? Has it made it worse in any way?
So I think there is absolutely no doubt that COVID has had a significant impact on financial crime. I couldn't quantify that impact today, but there's certainly been some disruption because of it in the area of financial crime. I mean, people working from home, for example, makes it far more difficult for financial institutions to verify customer identity. So there is obviously greater risk of fraud. Branch closures, and I know for a fact that I've tried to get to my bank a couple of times and not been able to because the branch is actually closed down during COVID. This means less cash and a lot more online transactions. And again, once the transactions go online, it increases the risk of digital crime. And I think finally, there's a lot more COVID-related cybercrime activity with COVID-themed phishing attacks where criminals install malware onto people's machines where they're then able to capture confidential information. So, I think that there has definitely been a massive advance in criminal activity because of COVID. And I think that it's going to take some time to really understand and quantify the damage that it's done.
You were talking as well, Rachel, in your speech about, I suppose, kind of solutions or advisory tips for people. If you had to pick the biggest risk when implementing a financial crime, a management solution, what would that be? And how would you kind of suggest then mitigating against that risk?
So, as I said, I've been working within the space of financial crime for 10 years now, and have worked with a number of organisations across different countries, different languages, and so on. I think in my experience, the thing really that makes projects or can make projects fail is a lack of executive level sponsorship. Or involvement, not just sponsorship, but involvement. It's always, or very often, just given to the compliance department and the IT department to say, we have a problem here. This is the amount of fraud losses that we're experiencing. It's a significant issue for us, or money laundering is really creating a problem for us. Go and sort it out. You can translate the regulations and define our requirements and then bring us a solution that will actually address that. Well, I don't think it should be handed over to the compliance department or IT just to sort out. It is absolutely should sit firmly within the sort of top 5 key initiatives of any organisation to combat financial crime. It is a big problem, and it's a problem that needs everybody's involvement to solve, I think.
We'll pick up on some more, I think, at these points a little bit later in our roundtable panel discussion as well. But for the moment, Rachel Pollack, VP of Professional Services at NICE Actimize, thanks for joining us here at our Women in Fin Crime event. And as I said, if you do want to send in a question for any of our delegates a little bit later, you can do so, as I said, in the Q&A, the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen, or you can get us it's hashtag Women in Fin Crime on social media. Now, our final panellist, our final delegate here to speak to you this morning is Kelly McCann, financial crime FI advisory expert. Kelly's a financial crimes risk executive who's over 10 years experience consulting with multinational clients. And you're very welcome, Kelly.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And thank you, AML Intelligence, and our hosts for the invitation to contribute among such a distinguished and accomplished group of women. It's quite an honor to speak on this day of International Women's Day, and I'm delighted to participate. So thank you all. So just a little bit background about me. As Andrea mentioned, I am a financial crime expert. I have a tremendous amount of experience working with multinational banks in different countries around the world. And in doing so, one of the biggest gaps that I've observed through my work advising multinational banks in developed countries and developing countries is a lack of understanding of how to implement the regulations that are mandated. FATF conducts training on who they are, what the organization is about, what they do, the mutual evaluation process, how the mutual evaluation process is implemented. And there's no clear guidance, though, that I've seen so far on how to actually implement the recommendations. There are interpretive notes, but these notes reiterate what should be done rather than how to do it and actually how to implement it. This cuts through the distinction of developing countries and developed countries. With banks based in respective countries, for example, the UK based in London, and the EU and in New York, US based companies with subsidiaries and branches throughout the world, or smaller banks based in the Middle East or Africa. Understanding how to implement financial crime regulations is really the missing piece. There's plenty of training on what the regulations are, but not enough training on implementation and putting policy into practice. Financial institution employees and government officials, for the most part, undertake and attest to the fact that they've been educated on the rules. However, training on guidance and how to create a robust program to mitigate the risks and adhere to these regulations is lacking. So today I would like to speak about these issues and what the current state is, what the FATF guidance and training is right now and what they offer, and the solutions and potential outcomes for future state. So from my observations on the ground and with these banks and in these countries, I've really recognized the disconnect between policy and practice. When providing workshops on what FATF recommendations are and how to understand what the recommendations are, generally there's an understanding of, okay, this is what is stated and the guidelines I should follow. But then the question is, how do I follow this? How do I implement a robust program to mitigate any issues in order to comply with recommendations? So there's an insufficient understanding on that level. And so the current environment, in my opinion, is a lack of clear understanding. Do you know why you were de-risked? For example, if you're in a correspondent banking relationship and you're the respondent bank, why were you de-risked and what happened? And they don't necessarily understand the reasons for that. And so there's a gap there. There's a lack of appropriate training. The training, there's training, but not the right kind of training that needs to be targeted. So you take the FATF 40 recommendations and really go down the list, and then within each recommendation, really provide examples of how successful programs have implemented the recommendations in peer countries, and perhaps FATF can provide some better guidelines on their website. Actual training, they have the interpretive notes, but the interpretive notes really focus on the shoulds rather than the hows. Lack of recent funding, there needs to be greater resources or funding put towards resources on training and education. There's a lack of effective application of the regulations and recommendations. So again, these are areas that really need to be focused on in order to have people that are compliance officers within banks, private banks, public banks, or central banks, to understand how to put the policy into practice. So currently FATF has a number of areas that they provide such guidance, but again, it's more about policy and the should. So they have a training center in Korea and Virtual Academy online, and they have interpretive notes. The interpretation provide greater detail and explain the recommendations, what the should is, and the explanation of the various stages of the mutual evaluation process and how the evaluators assess the countries. This is all very helpful and important and should be reviewed, but my suggestion would be to really take it from a high level and then filter it into a more practical level and provide training within the banks and the organizations internally, and explain how to do this from an implementation standpoint. And if there could be a best practices across the industries and across the various jurisdictions on the implementation process, I think that would be more effective, because if a country gets rated low, a low rating with FATF, it's in one sense they think they're blacklisted or gray listed, and that but reality is, if they're not complying with the recommendations, perhaps they didn't know how to implement that appropriately within the guidelines set forward. So the solutions, how to fix this, as many best practices state, a risk assessment is really important in order to identify where the organization is lacking, and on a country level, the national risk assessment, where the country is lacking in regulations, but providing a risk-based approach to address the issues. Countries and individual banks should really invest in and develop and create an internal department of specialists who can train compliance officers, government officials, and employees on how to implement the appropriate mitigants to adhere to prescribed regulations and recommendations. Perhaps a financial crime toolkit that really could focus on each one of the recommendations or the regulations and provide examples of implementation that has been successful, and guidelines on how to create a robust program to mitigate any potential risks or gaps. Concrete example: why the recommendation is important from a policy and operational or public or private sector perspective where appropriate. So really break down the recommendation and provide additional insights. There needs to be greater international collaboration and communication, sharing of best practices, as many of our speakers have touched on as well. There just needs to be a greater dialogue on this level, because there's so many cross-border transactions, as was noted earlier. Everything is digital these days, and so one country being better communication with another country and international regulatory bodies as well is only beneficial and needs to be increased and improved in order to stop this financial crime from occurring. Centralized authorities in countries need to be experts on the implementation, and then within the countries and within the banks, there needs to be specific individuals who are experts on the implementation and can provide that knowledge and insight within the organizations. Regional FATF style bodies need to focus on their country's specific risks. Countries have diverse legal, administrative, and operational frameworks and different financial systems. So you cannot take identical measures to counteract these threats, which you need to have a risk-based program and focus on the products and services that are offered within your organization or the jurisdiction with which you're operating in order to determine how to mitigate these risks, because one place will be different from another. There really needs to be a greater culture of compliance and a tone at the top, from a country level down to the institutional level. So the outcomes of implementing a more training, education, and knowledge on the actual implementation and putting policy into practice would be to generate greater trust in financial institutions with a specific focus on FATF gray listed countries. So in that light, that these countries can potentially increase their ratings and get out of the gray list and become develop potentially correspondent banking relationships with other countries and have a better reputation. Once they learn how to implement the regulations, then they can then actually act on it. And it's important to manage rather than avoid the money laundering and terrorist financing risk associated with business relationships. So potentially an outcome could be the corresponding relationships would increase, and there would be a renewal of correspondent banking relationships and an increase in economic development worldwide. Funds should be spent on and expenditures on training and education rather than fines and penalties. So more nuanced training and more individuals from the compliance departments focus on the implementation process rather than passing a test on understanding what the regulations are. They should be focused on what the implementation process is. So in summary, the resources should be focused on training and education and the implementation and practical application. I recently was on a webinar with the Center of Pakistan and International Relations, and I found an article in the New York Times that stated from Abdul Hafiz Sheikh, Pakistan's de facto finance minister. He said, "It's a big aim of the Prime Minister to curb money laundering. It's in their best interest for themselves, not just because the FATF is asking them to do so, but because they want to do so, and their effort is to come out of gray list soon." So I think as long as each country is focused on doing it for themselves rather than doing it from getting off the gray list, then I think that would be beneficial to all.
Kelly McCann, thanks very much for your remarks today and for your contribution. And if you don't mind, Kelly, I'm going to ask you to stay with us as well. We're not going to let you go away just yet. I'd also like to bring back our panellists, Sujana, Fed and Rachel. And indeed, I'd like to welcome you to our new panellist, who's just below me, I think, here on the screen as well, to Jackie King, who's the Executive Director with International Business at IBEC. Jackie currently serves there as the Executive Director at IBEC, which is of course our largest lobby group here in Ireland, and has over 20 years experience too working in global organisations. Look, if you want to get in touch with us, as I said, it's the Q&A. You can send a question in either through the chat box. It should be on the right hand side of your screen, or if you want to get us on social media, either you can just use the hashtag. It's Women in FinCrime. If you have a question that you'd like to pose to any of our panellists here at this morning's event. I just want to go back to a couple of different things things that some of you mentioned during your addresses today. And Sujata, I might perhaps maybe just start with yourself. You talked about the various different levels of kind of intelligence data and intelligence sharing information. I wonder, how can financial institutions manage the dilemma then of GDPR, which is of course something we were talking an awful lot about over the past 12 months, but that GDPR compliance with then data privacy on one hand and then data sharing then on the other?
Yeah, it's funny. It sounds contradictory, doesn't it? So yes, financial institutions have recognized the need that there should be collaboration in terms of sharing data, sharing intelligence, because like many of our speakers touched upon the fact that financial crime is an organized crime. It is not restricted to one bank or one country or a region. It uses all channels in all countries, all borders. So without data or intelligence sharing, how do you collaborate? And since we have all these data privacy regulations, GDPR being for EU, similarly every country has its own version of data privacy. So how then do you manage this this contradictory regulation? It might sound contradictory because you want to share data and collaborate on the one hand, but you are restricted because of these GDPR regulation, because then you cannot share the personally identifiable information about your customers and their activities and so on. So we are still awaiting regulatory guidance on that. So there is no workaround. I mean, no clear guidance from regulators as such. But then again, technology comes to our rescue as always. So we have what is now emerging as PETs, or privacy enhancing technologies. Honestly, these are more of privacy preserving rather than privacy enhancing, I would say. The PETs, the short form, these PETs are now being leveraged for sharing data across institutions. So how does this work? Now, this is actually sharing of intelligence without sharing the underlying personally identifiable or sensitive information about the customer and their activities. So when we talk about data sharing, if we talk about two banks which are using this PET or this privacy preserving technology, so bank number one wants to query on some information on bank number two. So the query is sent in an encrypted format. It travels encrypted, and it's processed in bank number two in an encrypted format. The results are again sent back in an encrypted format, and it's only at the originating bank where it gets decrypted. So in all these three stages, when data is at rest, in transit, and in process, in all these three stages, the data is actually encrypted. So the bank number two, where it is queried, does not get to know what was the query about. And bank number one does not get to know the details about that customer. It is only that query that, is the response to that query is returned back. So this is one of the technologies which is, which has delivered some good results in the last, I think, it was first introduced in tech sprint organized by FCA, if I'm not wrong. That was in 2019, when FCA organized a group of technology companies, and PETs was one of those advanced technologies which came into the fore. The Estonia's AML bridge, which I was mentioning, that is also a collaboration of the regulators of Estonia, the financial institutions of Estonia, the law enforcement, and technology vendor, of course. They're also, they are using the PET, or the privacy enhancing technology. And they are in a pilot phase right now. I think they started somewhere in September, if I'm not wrong. Okay. So that is also delivering some very good results. So we are seeing a lot of these use cases. There have been some companies in Ireland as well, in UK, in US. So this is a technology which is emerging, and institutions are able to securely share information. It's just the intelligence rather than the underlying PII data. Yeah, so that's been working very well.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sujata, because it does seem somewhat contradictory, initially on the face of it. I've been asking you, all of our audience here today, to get in touch with us, and you've been doing so in your droves. Sujata, I have a comment here for you from Sue, who said she loved your link that you're making to the impact on people, wildlife, climate and the ecosystem. The focus on prosecuting corporates is important, but changing the fight against corruption only happens when we start to feel the impact impact in a personal way. And as I said, you can keep those coming into it as well here at #WomenInFinCrime. Jackie King from IBEC, if I can bring you in. We've a question here from Elizabeth, who's got in touch with us, and she says, remote working has made firms review the processes which they use to adapt to servicing customers. The challenge is not changing the risk appetite to create an environment that aids criminals. I just wonder, like, when you talk about kind of the whole remote working, we're all doing it here obviously today for this morning's conference, but just I wonder what your view is on that.
Yeah, so I mean, it's inevitable. Certainly COVID has accelerated the move to digitization and in a number of ways, and it's had a lot of positive benefits and some challenges. So I don't think you can undo that or unlearn moving that in that direction. And certainly our businesses are learning to adapt and making decisions about what their structure is going to be, how they're going to offer services going forward, and certainly with all of that in mind, security at the heart of all that, because it's not just about the technology protecting your organization anymore. When you've got more people transacting in a digital way online, then security is important. And on the topic of, we're talking a lot about diversity and women in the workplace. Certainly there's been growing evidence that women are being negatively and disproportionately impacted, especially women in the workplace. So even in that respect, I think that organizations are thinking about that, particularly around the visibility of women, the multiple demands on women in the workplace, and so I think it is an issue that's all encompassing for businesses, and it doesn't focus on one specific area.
I have a question as well for Fed, which has actually received a lot of interaction from our delegates here. So I have to ask you, Fed. This watcher or viewer today has asked, they say, I've worked in the area of second line risk and compliance and fin crime for over 14 years, and I've experienced the lack of diversity, which you described in your opening address. If a woman in a senior role speaks up, it can often be seen as arrogance. And yet if a man does this, it's accepted. Well done in raising the issue. I just wonder if you could give some advice.
It is true. It is absolutely true. As women, we have more labels applied to us, and more easily than men do. People look at us and feel the need to make an assumption that we are either going to be soft or maternal or submissive, or they are going to see that when we speak up, that is out of line with their expected behavior of a woman, and therefore they put us into the category of aggressive, abrasive, too career-minded. And I simply ask why. I do not understand why must it be so easy for a man to go through life and go through without the number of labels and expectations and pressures being put on. And as women instead, we are told to be in a certain way and then criticized for not being in that way. I do not understand it. I have come to understand the sort of subliminal drivers, but I consider ourselves as humans, and as humans in the workplace, as rational, logical individuals, yet we seem to reject that, to apply that simple logic. It also, I would point out that that set of differing and contrasting expectations causes a number of women, especially younger women in the younger stages of their career, in the earlier stages of their careers, to feel confused and to actually be aggressive, to actually put an armor on because they feel the need to fight a certain environment around them. And I find that women find it more difficult and take a longer time to find themselves the true voice. And that's why the importance of role models, the importance to see that there are, how many, 5, 6 of us here, and we're all different, that there are different ways of being a woman, there are different ways of being an individual, and people must simply find their own way of being in the workplace rather than conforming to an expected model. So yes, that's my take on the topic.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Rachel, I have a question for you as well from one of our viewers here. They want me to ask you if you have any tips on how to get senior management buy-in.
Yeah, it's a very good question, actually. If I knew the answer, then it wouldn't still be a problem today. So I think one of the things that that I have experienced is if you have, ensure that there's a lot of communication, a lot of noise around the program that you're embarking on, and it's as a vendor of financial crime software, I would be going into the organization, into the bank or financial institution, working with the compliance department, working with the IT department to ensure that the program is set up for success. And one of the things that I say is, don't just make this an IT project. Don't just make it a compliance project. So I insist on having senior level involvement. I insist on having, program boards set up to ensure that there is a level of senior governance applied to the program of work. So I think it's a matter of calling it out at the beginning if it's not there, and if the compliance department or IT department have been given the job of implementing something, of addressing the financial crime issue, then they need to speak to the CEO, the other senior members of the organization to flag it and say this is not going to be successful unless we have senior level buy-in from all areas of the organization. So it's a matter of calling it out and putting in a governance structure that ensures that they're not only aware of the program, but actually involved in it, and sponsoring it and accountable as well. So it's not, again, as I said, it's not just the compliance officer's duty to become compliant. It is the senior management team's responsibility to be compliant.
A lot of questions too coming in here on the hashtag Women in Fin Crime regarding gender gaps and trying to kind of achieve a greater level of diversity. Jackie King from IBEC, I suppose, what's your view or your advice maybe on the best way on trying to kind of achieve that level of diversity?
Yeah, well, I think it's there's not one size, there's not one solution. I mean, we've got international instruments that put in place gender equality and gender balance and diversity guidelines, and just because it's written down doesn't mean it's going to happen. So I think generally it's a systemic problem. We've talked a lot about the behaviors and the challenges women face, but if it's a systemic problem, then it has to be approached systematically. So I think it starts from a business perspective in those organizations. Yes, absolutely have policies, and yes, absolutely have targets, and we can debate about quotas all day long. But they're important to have targets because you have to have something to work towards. And as Ed said, it's unfortunate that we're even having to talk about it in this day and age when the fight for gender equality and inclusion has been going on for centuries. So it's having those policies. And then it's the second part of that is the practices. So that is somewhat, in some cases, re-engineering your workplace, whether it's public sector or private sector, your HR services you provide, how you recruit, how you retain talent, the training that you provide, not just to women, but to men and managers, in identifying some of those issues. And then there's education, and that's for women too. I think Fed touched on as well. Women don't often feel that they have a place at the table, or they don't apply for promotions until they are overqualified, or they are apologetic for being at the table or in promoting their own success. So I think education is part of that. mentorship in the workplace is important, but also sponsorship, and that's where men come in as well. They play a key role in all of that. And then finally, it's profiling and promoting women and what they're doing and leading, not because they're women, but because they're experts. And we need our young girls and our future generation to speak up and to be involved and start educating them about their voice early on and their capabilities, and not being apologetic about that, about their expectations around being included and being respected. And so I think, you can't be it if you don't see it. So doing things like this is important, both inside and outside the organization. And for women too, women feeling that they are empowered in voting with their feet. If there's an organization that you want to work for or continue to work for, and they don't have these things in place for you, then make different decisions. So that's a long way of saying it's not one solution or answer. It's a systematic approach.
I have a question from Elena for Rachel as well. Do you think that the deterministic nature of AI, machine learning, or similar black box type tech solutions presents a barrier to effective oversight by management?
No, I don't think it's a barrier. It's an enabler. It just needs to be used in the correct way. And I think, one of the things that I was saying in my talk earlier is it's absolutely essential before you apply any technology, whether it's innovative or standard technology, is to really understand what the business requirements are. If you're having to interpret the regulations and translate them into your risk appetite and your business requirements, and then you apply the AI technology. So it's not going to do the job for you entirely. There's always going to be human intervention in some way, in terms of combating financial crime, but it is absolutely an enabler, not it's not instead of humans. It's not supposed to be used instead of humans. It's absolutely supposed to be used in collaboration and conjunction. It just helps us to make better decisions and helps us to kind of automate certain things that take a long time to do.
Okay. The Minister mentioned that many women in previous generations didn't get the opportunity for career progression, but now that in Ireland it's different times and barriers to success for women are fading away. This is a comment, by the way, from one of our viewers here this morning. What are the panel's thoughts on women in fin crime in those cultures which traditionally haven't offered the same pathways of opportunity for women? And Federica, I might ask you.
Yes, and I alluded perhaps earlier to my being of a dual nationality and having experienced life amongst many different countries. It is true that there are different cultures, and there are cultures in which the role of women is still seen as being in the kitchen making dinner, which does, by the way, nothing bad about it. It just needs to be a choice rather than the expectation. I don't think that success needs to be necessarily measured in numbers. I don't think that in every segment of society, across every country, we will ever achieve the same degree of women in the profession, women in financial crime. I think what is important is that in all countries, in all cultures, the choice exists, that at least people see the fact that there is a possibility to choose a certain path rather than others. And globalization offers an opportunity in that sense, because whilst it might have been difficult, for example, even for this conversation today, to reach certain parts of the world, it can much more easily reach it today. Granted, if there isn't an interest already in the topic, perhaps people will not be looking at this conversation or would not be listening at this thing. But what the point I'm making here is that with globalization, with a world without barriers, which criminals take advantage every single day, it is possible to reach. And therefore, I go back to the point, it is important that we continue to have role models, that we continue to show how it is possible to be a woman, a mother, a pilot, a wife, a girlfriend and a successful woman in financial crime. But we need to show it to the world, and that's the only way forward.
Just briefly, Kelly McCann, on that point, do you think, is it improving or is it still missing something?
I think it's definitely improving. In the United States, we now have a female vice president, and she's both of Black and Indian heritage. And so that's been a great example for a lot of young children, as well as women who are interested in becoming more involved in politics. So I think that that's been a good change. Certainly, we need more involvement for women at higher levels. There's a lot of women who are in financial crime at more junior and mid levels, but I think the higher levels and the more executive level and management, where there's more decision making, is crucial for women to take a seat at the table in those places.
I know I have to give a final word to somebody today, but maybe just Sujata, to bring you in on that point. Do you think are better strides, better efforts being made, or could more be done?
Well, I think, in the world of finance itself, in the financial services industry, we do not have a dearth of role models. But touching upon what Federica also mentioned in her speech earlier, it's not enough to appoint somebody in that position. That person needs to feel included. You need to enable, empower, uh, groom them for the next position. So we have these corporate governance rules where a certain percentage of the board should be women, but according to me, that is not really a statistic which makes a company diversity friendly or empowering women. I would like to see whether that same percentage is actually there across the ranks, and whether this is making an impact. Whether these diversity who have been appointed, actually, whether they are their voices are heard, whether their vision is being included as part of the overall the framework, the vision, the strategy. And it cannot be just at the board. The board is the highest decision making authority. It has to be implemented and executed across the ranks as well. So yes, we do have very strong role models. I think our minister who addressed us at the opening session is a great example. And then we have Janet Allen and Ursula von der Leyen. So I think we have enough role models and we are seeing them making an impact. So I think things are moving forward in the right direction.
And I think that's a lovely note to wrap on today. I could stay and talk to you all day, by the way, but I did promise I wouldn't keep you too long this morning. I want to thank our panel for all of your contributions. I think it's been a really thought-provoking, invaluable and just a really insightful, rich morning of discussion. So thank you so much for that and for your time and for taking questions as well. I'd love to thank all of our viewers for getting in touch, for your interaction, and we'd love to get some feedback from you as well on the event. You can still do so through the Q&A chat box, but you can also get us as well social media, Twitter, Facebook. You can get us through LinkedIn, and it's at the hashtag Women in FinCrime event, and you can also get us as well through at AML Intelligence. Again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining us from right across the globe here today to Dublin for this morning's Women in FinCrime event, and thanks also to AML Intelligence for hosting today's morning session. Thank you.